In the previous lesson, we talked about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. She imagined a monster created in a laboratory. Robert Louis Stevenson instead asks a much more disturbing question. What if the scientist doesn't create a monster but releases one that already exists? This is the idea behind The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886. Before entering the novel, we need to know the author because Stevenson's life helps us understand his obsession with duality. That's the main theme in this story. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1850. He was a very sick child and he spent much of his childhood isolated, educated at home in a strict Calvinist religious atmosphere, and this solitude strengthened his imagination and inner life. His family wanted him to become an engineer, and he studied engineering and later law, graduating in 1875. However, he didn't feel this was his true path, so he chose to become a writer and went against his family's expectations. When he was 30, he married Fanny Osborne, an American woman 10 years older than him, who was already divorced. Victorian society considered this scandalous, and his parents initially opposed the marriage. Stevenson had no biological children, but he became very close to Fanny's son Lloyd, whom he treated almost as a son. This choice marked a clear break with the expectation of respectable Victorian age. He started behaving in a way that Victorian society didn't like. Long hair, eccentric manners, and open rejection of his family's religious values. In a period where appearance and morality were extremely important, Stevenson chose a bohemian life. So even in his personal life, we already see a tension between social respectability and individual freedom. Because of his poor health, he traveled often to warmer places, living in different parts of Europe and finally in Samoa. The local people admired him and gave him the name Tusitala, meaning teller of tales. He died there in 1894 of a brain hemorrhage and was buried on the top of Mount Vea. During the 1880s, he became a very successful novelist. He was one of the most famous writers of adventure stories in the late 19th century. His novel Treasure Island became a model for pirate stories, with his charismatic pirate Long John Silver. In addition, Stevenson produced travel writing and essays inspired by his journeys across Europe and the Pacific. But he also wrote something completely different, a psychological and gothic story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Just like Mary Shelley, Stevenson was inspired by a nightmare. He dreamt of a man transforming into a monster after drinking a chemical mixture. He was so impressed that he immediately began writing and produced a first version very quickly. The novel is set in late Victorian London, a respectable but deeply divided city where elegant houses stand next to dark streets and crime. The story begins with a lawyer, Mr. Utterson, who hears from his relative Mr. Enfield about a strange man who one night trampled a young girl in the street and walked away. The witnesses stopped him and threatened a public scandal. To avoid disgrace, the man agreed to pay compensation to the girl's family. He paid with a check signed by the well-known and respected scientist Dr. Henry Jekyll. The man's name was Edward Hyde. Utterson is immediately worried. He has recently read Dr. Jekyll's will, which says that in case of Jekyll's disappearance or death, all his property would go to Mr. Hyde. So Utterson suspects blackmail. Utterson later meets Hyde in person and feels immediate horror and disgust. Stevenson never describes Hyde precisely, yet everyone who sees him instinctively perceives something deeply evil about him. Meanwhile, Dr. Jekyll appears calm and sociable. He reassures Utterson and asks him not to worry about Hyde. However, after a short time, Jekyll suddenly stops seeing his friends and isolates himself in his laboratory. One night, a brutal crime shocks London. An old and kind politician, Sir Danvers Carew, is violently murdered in the street. A witness identifies the killer, Edward Hyde. When the police search Hyde's house, they find evidence of the murder, but Hyde has disappeared. After this event, Dr. Jekyll seems to change. He becomes religious, charitable, and sociable again, and promises Utterson he will never see Hyde again, but soon Jekyll begins to behave strangely. Jekyll soon locks himself inside his laboratory and refuses all visitors. His servant Poole becomes frightened and asks Utterson for help. Utterson and Poole finally break the door down and they find a shocking scene. The body of Hyde lies on the floor, dead after drinking poison. Dr. Jekyll has disappeared. On the desk, Utterson discovers a written confession revealing the truth. Dr. Jekyll believed that every human being contained both good and evil and tried to separate them scientifically. He created a potion that transformed him into Edward Hyde, who represented his hidden desires and freedom from social rules. At first, Jekyll enjoyed this double life, but Hyde became stronger and the transformations began to happen without the potion. After Hyde committed murder, Jekyll realized he was losing control and that Hyde had become his dominant self. Unable to prevent the final transformation, Jekyll chose suicide to stop Hyde forever. The novel ends tragically. Dr. Jekyll's scientific ambition led him to destroy himself. Stevenson's message is clear. Human beings are not purely good or purely evil. Instead, both sides coexist inside every person, and denying one part of ourselves can make it even more dangerous. In the late 19th century, people were becoming increasingly interested in human psychology and behavior, and society was starting to realize that personality might not be completely unified. Stevenson uses science in the novel through the potion, but the experiment is mainly symbolic. The real subject is not chemistry, it's human nature and the coexistence of good and evil within the same individual. Now let's look at the main themes in the novel. Stevenson is writing in the Victorian age, a society obsessed with respectability. A gentleman had to appear moral, disciplined, and rational in public. However, Stevenson suggests that under this respectable surface there are impulses, desires, and instincts that society forces people to hide. And repressing human instincts does not eliminate them. It only hides them until they return in a more frightening form. Another theme is the double. Jekyll and Hyde are not two individuals, they are two aspects of the same person. Even London reflects this idea. It has elegant streets and dark criminal areas. Jekyll's house also has two entrances, a respectable front door and a sinister back door used by Hyde. So the city becomes a metaphor for the duality of the human mind. The novel also involves science. Dr. Jekyll experiment ignored moral responsibility. The novel reflects Victorian fears about progress and how knowledge without ethics can become destructive. Now let's start reading the novel from the opening scene.
Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone, to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many, what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend.
Utterson represents the respectable Victorian gentleman. Outward discipline and self-control cover an inner emotional life. Through him, Stevenson anticipates the central theme of the novel, the division between public respectability and private nature, which will later become extreme in the figure of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop front stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger.
In this description, Stevenson focuses on the setting. The street looks clean and respectable, but it is surrounded by a poor and dark area, and this contrast reflects the theme of duality.
2 doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and distained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the moldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed," said Mr. Utterson, with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world, about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps, street after street, and all the folks asleep, street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church, till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a view halloo, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look, so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she had been sent, put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to Sawbones, you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary, of no particular age and color, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with the desire to kill him. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other.
This passage introduces Hyde and immediately presents him as unnatural and frightening. He calmly tramples a child, and Enfield says he did not seem like a man but like a juggernaut, suggesting a force without feelings or morality. His physical appearance also causes instinctive disgust in people, even if they cannot explain why. Another important detail is the reaction of the crowd. They do not only want justice, they threaten scandal, because reputation is crucial in Victorian society. So Hyde pays money to keep the event secret. This again shows the Victorian compromise. Society cares more about preserving respectability than about openly confronting evil. The next quotation comes from Jekyll's final confession at the end of the novel, when the mystery has finally been revealed. Jekyll explains the idea behind his experiment. He has realized that human nature is divided.
With every day and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck. That man is not truly one, but two. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advanced infallibly in one direction, and in one direction only. It was on the moral side, and in my own person, that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that, of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both.
This passage is also from Jekyll's final confession. Here he admits that he personally experienced the duality of man. Inside his consciousness he felt two opposite natures fighting, the moral and the primitive one. He understands that he is not simply good or evil, he is both at the same time. Stevenson was writing in a period fascinated by scientific discoveries. Yet he warned that knowledge without moral awareness could be dangerous. Like other 19th century works, the novel shows that science is not evil in itself. The real danger appears when humans believe they can control human nature completely.